I just gonna move my hair because I'm pretty sure I just sneezed all over it. Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. This is the first video of 2020. I'm going to do essentially the same thing I did at the beginning of 2019, and that is make a video about my 2020 reading list. And staying true to that theme, you are, again, stacked on a pile of books. Also, I didn't start recording the audio on my phone, so hopefully now you have some better audio. Gosh, it has been a long time since I've sat down and filmed a video, clearly. When I made my 2019 reading list last year, I had 12 different books picked out, all of which I thought would be very interesting to read. I figured giving myself one book a month was a good place to start. I was aware that I wasn't the best reader in terms of speed or attention span, so I thought that one book a month, 12 books in total, was a really good place to start. But I hadn't taken into account how much of a poor reader I was. So that's why part of this video is titled How I Learned to Read. Not because I was illiterate, but because I realized in this past year that I'm not good at reading. I realized this past year there are certain types of books, certain styles of writing that I am drawn to more, that hold my attention better, and I've also realized that there are other books that while I might find them very interesting, they do not hold my attention very well. And going into 2020, I wanted to try to make another reading list, and I wanted to also tweak it slightly, taking into account these things I've learned about how I read and apply them this time to hopefully have a better outcome than I did last year. So, starting, I wanted to just quickly recap what my 2019 reading list was and show you actually how far I got through that. These were the 12 books I had picked out for my reading list in 2019. Of these 12 books, these are the 4 I actually read. And I've gotten about halfway through the hard copy of Surprised by Hope and further through the audio version of Surprised by Hope, which I will come back to this a little later. When I had started my 2019 reading list, I was already beginning on The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, so I was able to read through that pretty quickly. It was sort of adventure-based. There was lots of action happening, lots of things, lots of storytelling. It held my attention really well, so I was able to read through this pretty quickly. Then I jumped into E is for Evidence, the Sue Grafton book, next. And because I know already that I really enjoy these books, they are very simply written. They're not a very high level of reading, but they keep my attention. They're murder mystery novels. They're very action-packed. They're very descriptive. I really enjoy them, so I read this one next because I knew I would be able to read it very quickly. I think I might have read F is for Fugitive right after that, again, because it's a simple book. They are size-wise, F is for Fugitive is about twice the size of E, but they still didn't take me any longer to read. They're just that easy of books that just hold my attention really well. Next up, I read Alan Alda's Things I Overheard While Talking to Myself, and this one, it was very different from the first 3 that I read, in that this is a biography, this is factual, this is Alan Alda's life and stories of him going and speaking at all these different events and things that he learned while doing that. And it tells a few backstories of things that happened previous in his life that he's drawing from when he talks at these events. So this one was very different from the first 3 in genre, but it was still very much a narrative and storytelling at its base, which is why I was able to go through it so quickly. And this one actually ended up taking me a little longer. I took probably a month and a half or so to read this one because it wasn't fully fiction and that fictitious story adventure line that I was so used to reading. It did take me a little bit to get into this, but once I adjusted to this type of storytelling, then I was like, oh yeah, I'm all for this, cool, let's read it, and I was fine. It just took me a little bit longer. After that, I made my fatal error. I had read all 4 of those. I was fairly well on pace. I had gotten really ahead of myself on my 1 book per month with these two because I was able to read them so fast. So because I took a little bit longer on this one, I was like, that's no big deal. I'm still right on pace. Like, I'm doing great. So I decided to jump into Surprised by Hope by N.T. Wright. I love this book, but this book, if all of the other books I have read to this point are over here, Surprised by Hope is over there, in the other room, trying to dig a hole through the wall to get further away. There is nothing about this book that is anything like these books at all. And when I made my reading list, I did not take that into account. That is where I had the biggest hiccup, was I was trying to read this book like these storybooks. It can't be read like that. It can't. This book I struggled with for the remainder of the year, and I had to put it away a couple of times. Another big mistake I was making was I was trying to read 1 book at a time, which makes sense, but Dan, my husband, he will be reading several different books at once. Not like having all of them open on the table looking at them, but he'll have 1 book that when he lays down to go to bed, he'll read some of. And then when he's up and about during the day, he has another book somewhere that he'll pull out and he'll read a little further into. So he has bookmarks in probably 6 or 7 different books at any given time. The thought of that drives me insane. So I thought, I can't do that. I need to focus on 1 book at a time and 1 book only, and I can't move on to another book until I finish that 1 book. And that is where Surprised by Hope kind of killed me. So I went into it trying to read it like I do the storybooks, trying to read it in a novel storytelling type way, and because that's not how this book is supposed to be read, it made it so difficult to retain my attention, and it made it near impossible to get through. I'm further along than what the bookmark shows because I have been listening to it on Audible, which has been helping a lot, but I haven't done that really recently either because I needed to just take a step away from this book for a few months. But Surprised by Hope is just, it's a lot of information. It's a very informative book, and again, I was used to narratives and stories, and having to then switch to an informative style messed me up. As a result, I couldn't get through this book because I was caught on that snag that I didn't realize was a snag until much later. And I also couldn't get into any of my other books in my reading list because I had that mindset of I need to just read 1 book at a time. For 2020, I wanted to change that a lot. I did read a couple of other books because I had gotten out of reading for a solid 2 or 3 months. I hadn't read anything because that I was just so caught up on not being able to get through the Surprised by Hope. I found books that I know I have read, that I know I have enjoyed, that I know have been painfully simple to read, and I read them. So I had these series of... It's The Girl Online. It's by Zoe Sugg. She is a British YouTuber that I watch, actually, that wrote this trilogy. And very, very simple, obviously, fictional story about an online blogger. And it's again, narrative, storytelling. And it captured my attention. And it was a very low reading level, so it was very easy for me to read and breeze through quickly. Surprised by Hope is also one of those books that it's a much higher reading level, which was another thing I had to adjust to. So I had read, I don't remember this is the first one of the 3, I don't remember if I had read this one in 2019 or if I had read it in 2018, but in 2019, I did get the other 2 books that are in the series, and I was able to breeze through both of these, like, in a month's time. One of them I finished in, like, a week. And, again, they were just very simple to read. It was in that moment that I kind of realized, after I'd finished reading both of those, that I realized, okay, this is good. This is, okay, I'm starting to get into the groove of it. Like, I still thought that if I just forced myself to read, I would get better at it, not realizing that I have to go into a book with the right mindset of what I'm getting into. With that, again, I had taken a break from reading for a while, just because I still didn't have that right mindset. Well, we recently got some books to look through, and I picked up this one, which is called Living, Working, and Dying in the National Parks, and it says Ranger Confidential. It's by Andrea Lankford, and this is, again, very much storytelling, but it's also true, and it's about different rangers who work in the national parks, and it's all stories of some of the crazy rescue missions they've had to go on, and some of the really, scary situations they were put into, some of the really stupid campers that were there, and people who were just not following the rules at all, that were driving these rangers insane because then they would have campers die because they weren't following the rules. It did take me a little bit to read. Not that long, though. This probably start to finish took me a month, 3 weeks, maybe? Which I really liked because this one I only finished about a week and a half ago or so the middle of December. But again, it was really interesting. It held my attention really well. The reading level wasn't the highest. So, those books are essentially all I have read in 2019, which, looking at the stack, it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe 8.5. I'm not happy with that. I really want to be able to do better. So, one of the things I'm doing with my 2020 reading list is making sure that I take into account where my reading level is, where I want it to be, and how I can get there. And how I can get there is when I do continue to read Surprised by Hope, because I want to finish this book, it's good, that I know to approach it in an intellectual manner, and knowing that I'm going into it reading information rather than story, and be okay if I need to put it down for a while and start another book. That's something else I'm going to try a lot of, is I'm going to try, if one book becomes too much for me at that moment, start up a different book. Sometimes I do need some of the really simple books that I know I can read and can read fast to get me back into the habit of reading, but I don't want to be relying on those books to make me feel like I can only read some books because I can't read this one because I'm reading it too slow. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. Also, I might not be making any sense at all, and I apologize. My 2020 reading list is significantly smaller than my 2019 reading list was. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 books on it, and that's it. Because 2 of these books I am anticipating being quite time-consuming for me to read. One of these I'm thinking is going to be pretty intermediate, and then 4 of them are the Sue Grafton novels. I'll just show you. I've grabbed 4 Sue Grafton novels that I want to make sure I read this year. It is G, H, I, and K, and I don't have J in there because I read J a long time ago, and I'm not going to reread it right now because I have a lot of these to get through. And I put these in here because I know I can read them quickly, and I know I'm going to need that little boost of confidence to help me continue through the rest of these books. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you know that there is a series of books you can read and read well and read quickly, don't be afraid to scatter those throughout the more difficult books. I am going to need that confidence booster as I'm reading these more difficult books. So there's nothing wrong with that. Just don't limit yourself to these books. Be willing to experiment and go outside of your comfort zone with reading, and reading more difficult books that are more time-consuming to read, that you might have to read sections of multiple times before you can move on because you don't fully grasp it the first time you read it, and that's totally fine. So I have 4 of those that I'm going to try to read. Another one I have is Oliver Sacks' Awakening. A couple years ago, I had read his book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was, again, very much a storytelling book, but it was real cases of people with, was it right brain diseases? I think it was right brain, the temporal lobe, so the right temporal lobe diseases. And just these incredible stories, but there was a lot of specific doctoral information mixed into that as well. And in the case studies, So there was some areas that were very easy to read and then some areas that were a little harder to read, and it went back and forth. This book, they say it's about a group of patients who contracted sleeping sickness during the Great Epidemic just after World War I. Frozen for decades in a trance-like state, these men and women were given up as hopeless until 1969, when Dr. Oliver Sacks gave them the then-new drug L-Dopa, which had an astounding explosive awakening effect. So then this book basically recounts some of these cases of their patients, the lives that they had before they fell asleep into this like coma-like state, and them waking up, and how they were reintroduced to the world. And I think that sounds fascinating, and having already read a book by Oliver Sacks, I'm a little more familiar with his writing style, I know a little more what to expect, and I know this is not as easy of a reading level as all of the Sue Grafton books are, so I know it is a step up. So that's why this one's in here, because I can already anticipate enjoying it, and I can already anticipate it challenging me a little bit. Then I have, obviously, Surprised by Hope, because I need to get through this. Again, same instance with the Oliver Sacks. I know I enjoy it, but this one is a lot more difficult for me to get through, so I know it's going to take me a while, but I also know what to expect. The last one on my reading list is one that I had on my reading list last year, and I'm keeping all of my books from last year very close by as options if I wanted to go back and read any of them, because all of these I still think are really interesting. John Cleese's autobiography, Johnny Cash's biography, The Odyssey of Homer, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which I think would be really easy to read, The Lightning Thief, which is the first book in the 5th series of Percy Jackson, I think. Is it the 5th or the 4th? There's a bunch of different series of these Percy Jackson books, but this is the first book of this series. And then Kathy Reich's Death du Jour. All of these I still think would be really interesting to read, but I'm not necessarily going to put them on my reading list because I don't want to have a huge stack of books that I'm suddenly intimidated by that I feel like I can't get through fast enough. So now that I know 12 books was a bit too much, I'm narrowing it down to like 7. But the last book I had on my list was Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Ever since we found this at the thrift store, I have been very interested to read it because I love the Disney movie, but we should all know the Disney movies are very different from the original stories. All you gotta do is read the grim fairy tales of Cinderella to find that one out. Ever since I saw this, I thought, I really want to read this, but then when I got it, I realized it's the abridged version. And this is still a pretty big book with pretty tiny little font in there for being the abridged version. Well, Dan and I were at the thrift store, as we are often, looking through the books. I found the unabridged version. It's mildly larger. So this is on there. Again, this one I am anticipating having to set down a little bit, potentially. Again, although it is very much a storytelling novel, I think the writing style itself is going to be very different from anything I am used to, and I think that in and of itself is going to take a lot of patience on my part. This is my new 2020 reading list that I have, and my hope is that I can get through all 7 of these books and be able to have time in between these books, time after all of these books, to dive into some of the other books I had in my last year's reading list. And hopefully when I come to you guys the beginning of January 2021, I can show you this stack plus more of books that I have fully read in this year. Let me know in the comments if what I said made sense at all. I feel like I kind of had an aha moment when I realized all of this and was like, oh, there's different ways of reading books, which is really sad because that should have been something I retained from school. I was a very poor student in the fact that I'm not good at retaining information unless I want to learn it, and it wasn't often that I was in school wanting to retain any of the information I was learning. So I'm kind of going through and redoing all of that now that I am out of school. But I hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Let me know if you have any books that you really enjoy that you recommend, because I am constantly looking for new books to add to our library. This is one bookshelf behind me of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 that we currently have, and not all of those shelves are full yet on all of those bookcases, so I'm open for suggestions of books we could get to fill said shelves. I hope you guys have had a great week. I hope you have a great week, and I will see you in the next video. Bye! I still can't get over how huge of a difference this is. Is this really, like, are abridged versions really, like, half the size of the full version? I want to know what was taken out of this book that I wouldn't have known if I had just read the abridged version.